It's a pleasure to be here and pleasure to see some of my old friends and colleagues, and then some people I haven't met yet. I think this may be a timely presentation. I think a lot of us, while labs are closed, things like that, are using the time to catch up on writing, but then there's the matter of editing and proofreading before submission. So hope this will be a helpful presentation. Normally I give these presentations in person, and normally I might even bring something to eat, bring some dessert. Sue probably remembers I like to bake, but clearly, I mean, Zoom is pretty wonderful, but they haven't come up with anything that will allow you me to transmit any baked goods to you. So let me give you a rain check on that. And so let me give a brief overview. And as noted, I'll be sharing these slides. I thought we'd have some preliminaries, talk about some of the general things to check for when editing your work. And also we'll briefly go through some checklists for editing papers and proposals. And again, you'll get the slides so you can refer to these. And one of the papers I mentioned as a resource later has additional checklists. Talk about some of the common problems to remedy. I mean, usually at these presentations, we have some people who are not native users of English. And so some special tips with regard to some difficult things in English or stumbling blocks to address. We'll also talk a little bit about things to look at when proofreading. In other words, once something's really finished and you're looking for typographical errors. Something that I thought might be relevant that I don't usually include in these talks, but I thought with postdocs might be helpful is editing things in response to reviewer feedbacks. Once you've submitted a paper and maybe you hear back and say, yeah, they'd like to publish it, but you need to make certain revisions, sort of a system for approaching that. And then also some resources and some questions at the end. And I realize different people have different schedules now. A lot of people, I think, have more flexible schedules than usual, others not. But what I will try to do is finish the main part of this presentation by about 1 o'clock, but I'm glad to stay on for more discussion. I don't have my next Zoom meeting till 2 o'clock, so I'm pretty flexible. So first of all, some preliminaries. One is just sort of why bother editing your own work? I think it may be fairly apparent, but let me sort of spell it out. I think for many of us, maybe particularly at the postdoc stage, there's great incentive to get things published. And I think by having something well edited before it's submitted, it can increase the likelihood of acceptance. One is that, for example, different journals or different granting agencies have specific criteria for content and style, and so your writing can make sure it meets the criteria. I think a big one is avoiding misinterpretation. I think if something's well edited and really clear, people aren't as likely to misinterpret it. I know sometimes people get really frustrated and they say, the reviewer said I didn't say this, but I did say it. Well, maybe it wasn't said clearly. And then I think more generally, just by creating a good impression that if something's well edited, it just gives the impression that you as an author are competent and that it's a good piece of work. I put in bold probably the most important thing is that having something well edited aids communication with readers. I mean, my feeling is even if something's pretty technical, it should be something that your intended readers will understand on first reading, not something where they have to read a sentence 4 times to understand what you're trying to get at. So I think aid communication, avoid miscommunication. I think another big advantage of editing your own work well is that it can minimize editing by others. because I think even if someone's a really skillful editor, anytime you edit someone's work, there's some risk that things may be misinterpreted or distorted. And so I know I almost play a game to try to see how little editing I can get my things to have by someone else. So I think for all these reasons, it's a worthwhile investment of time to edit your own work. I think a lot of people, when they think of editing their own work, they just think of editing, improving the grammar, improving the punctuation. But to me, those are sort of the superficial things. They're important, but they're not the key things. The key things in a good paper are the content and the organization and the clarity. So my feeling is those are the main key things to check for. And then, those should be clear. And then on top of that, there is the polishing the language, the grammar, the spelling, punctuation, but they're not all of it or even the main part. Something else I think is a challenge in editing your own work is gaining sufficient distance. I think lots of times we are so close to our own work that we can't view it objectively, and we see maybe what we think we said, not what we said. And so have a picture looking out into the distance. Those of you who've been in my office, this is actually the window of my office. Haven't been in that office for over a month now since I'm sheltering in place, but there are, I think, a number of ways to gain sufficient distance. One is simply setting the draft aside for a while. I find if I do that, often I'll come back and think, why did I say that? Or why did I have a whole paragraph? I can say that in one sentence. So I think that is helpful. Of course, that takes planning. I find sometimes I don't draft something till the last minute and then I can't do that. But I find that's helpful in gaining distance and objectivity. Another thing is printing out the draft. I think a lot of us are used to just working on a computer, but I find sometimes when I look at the printed draft, I will notice things I didn't notice otherwise. One, it gives me a fresh view. It also, I find, helps me notice macro level aspects. If I take the different pages and like spread it out, I will notice, for example, maybe that I've begun 6 paragraphs in a row in the same way, or that the paragraph lengths are weird, something like that. Another thing that can help gain objectivity is just changing the look of the draft so you can look at it with fresh eyes. Sometimes changing the typeface, increasing the margin so it's maybe a really long, narrow column like a newspaper, or printing it out on colored paper. All those kinds of things can jar the mind. And I think perhaps the most useful thing is reading the draft aloud. I find I will notice a lot of things I didn't notice otherwise. It's a good way to notice if there are, let's say, skipped words, or I find if there is a sentence that, I have to take 4 breaths during, I realize I shouldn't have a sentence that goes on for 2 pages. So all of these things, I think, can help. Also, I think it's helpful to think how editorially you're going to approach it. I mean, a lot of us, if we're editing things, will go beginning to end. But for example, a lot of papers really do revolve around the tables and figures. So sometimes it's helpful to edit the tables and figures the first. Or some people will start by checking the references first. It's a, sort of an easy mechanical way to start. Also, the question of macro or micro. Some people find it helpful to start macro first, for example, regarding the overall organization, and then move to micro, for example, the wording. Some people find it's helpful, they like to attend to details first and then move to macro. And I find I'll sort of alternate. Often I'll start with macro and then move to micro, but then as I do micro, I notice some things about macro and move back and forth. In some ways, I liken it to using a microscope. I find it helpful, get the big view with a low power, but then move on to high power, oil immersion or whatever. But then I'll notice something and I want to look at the big view again. So that can be helpful. Also, as we'll talk about later, it can be overwhelming to try to edit for everything at once. So sometimes it's helpful to do it in several passes. Let's say one pass just looking for organization, or another pass maybe just looking at punctuation, and another pass maybe looking to see if references are cited correctly, and so forth. And I think basically editing's an iterative process. I don't think any of us catch everything going through something once. That usually it entails reviewing material at least twice, sometimes several. So before we move on, this may be a good time to pause, see if there are any questions. Sue, are there any questions at this point?
I don't see any in the chat.
And so I'll just pause for a second, see if anybody has anything in the chat or anybody wants to call out anything, either questions or things you'd like to add.
I just want to say that as a pathology resident, I really appreciate the analogy with the low magnification and the higher mag during the editing process.
Good. I'm glad that analogy was meaningful. I was a little hesitant because I realized there were pathology residents there, and I thought, oh no, what if I was doing it the wrong way?
No, it makes total sense to me.
Okay, great. So why don't we consider some of the things to check for when you're editing your work? First of all, looking at the crafting, a variety of things to look for. One is logic. Are the ideas presented in a logical order, or would another order be more logical? I know, for example, one thing I'll look at is lists, and are the lists well organized? Are there clear transitions from idea to idea? Do things flow? Another thing is, are overviews presented before details? Again, it can be very helpful to readers who aren't familiar with things. For example, if they're good, like say, summaries at the beginning of sessions, or particularly good topic sentences that orient people. Are paragraphs an appropriate length? I find a lot of times when I edit things for other people, I find that there's some paragraphs that are just so long that they're really intimidating and hard to follow. And so I'll sometimes break up some paragraphs. As we talked about, do paragraphs have strong topic sentences? Often in a scientific paper, if they're good, strong topic sentences, it makes it really nice for the reader because they just want to skim. They can just read the first sentence of each paragraph. Are sentences an appropriate length? I find when I'm doing drafts, a lot of my sentences are too long and too hard to follow. There'll be these long sentences with parentheses within parentheses within parentheses. And I realize I'm trying to say 4 things at once. And so one thing that I often check for is sentence length. And my bells sort of go off if I see that a sentence is more than, let's say, 3 lines of type long. It's probably too long. Are grammar, spelling, punctuation, and word usage correct throughout? And again, I think it's really important, but I didn't put it first because I don't think it's most important. Because if the other things don't work, having good grammar doesn't even matter. Another thing to check for is, are the antecedents of all pronouns clear? In other words, if a word like it is used, is it clear what the it refers to? Are appropriate verb tenses used? I know that can get tricky. Usually for the scientific paper, materials and methods and results are almost all in past tense, but then introduction and discussion may have a mix of tenses. And are the citations and references in the required formats, which is certainly, if you're using a reference manager, that makes it a lot easier, but I find you still have to check because sometimes glitches do get through. Some other things, general things to check, no matter what kind of thing you're writing, is do the content and technical level suit the audience? Because you may be, let's say, writing about the same research, but depending on the journal you're aiming for, it might be different. For example, if it's a general scientific journal, you may not be able to assume that all people know about your small research area. Whereas if it's a journal in your specific discipline or subdiscipline, you could assume more knowledge and assume more interest in maybe some of the details. Is all the reasoning correct and clear? All the logic good? Is the information consistent throughout? I find sometimes in revising things, there'll be inconsistencies. Let's say working on a grant proposal and originally thought would, I don't know, have so and so many experimental animals or whatever, and then you change the plan, but have forgotten to change it in an abstract or summary. And so going through, making sure everything is consistent. Are all the tables and figures necessary? Sometimes there are some that really aren't needed. But on the flip side, should any tables or figures be added? Are all the cited items listed in the reference list, or is there something you cited but forgot to put in the reference list? Or on the flip side, has everything in the reference list actually been cited in the text? A more general question is just, are you comfortable with everything in the piece of writing? Or is there something that maybe you need to, check again or think out more thoroughly or get permission for, whatever? If a checklist was provided, did you use it? I really like the fact that some journals actually have checklists. And so if you had it, did you use it? And, finally, have all instructions been followed? I mean, I find it really sad when, for example, a proposal gets disqualified because some of the instructions weren't followed. And I find myself in my final check, very often when I'm checking the instructions, I find that there's something I did wrong or forgot to do. So those were some of the general aspects. And then I think it can be helpful to have specific checklists for specific kinds of things. And one of the resources that I will mention at the end, and that is openly accessible, has specific checklists for few kinds of documents. And let me go through some. Probably many of you will be writing scientific papers or other journal articles. And so a checklist for this one, starting with the title, does it accurately and concisely reflect the content? Are the appropriate people listed as authors? Does the introduction provide sufficient context? Does the introduction show what gap the research is to fill? Does the introduction indicate the hypotheses, research questions, or objectives? Does the method section provide enough information to replicate the research? And does the method section provide the right information to evaluate the research? And are sources of reagents, equipments, animals, and so forth identified? And continuing this checklist, if humans or animals were studied, are approvals noted? Many journals will require that to even consider a paper. Are the results presented in a logical order? Are they presented in appropriate detail? Is there enough detail, but not excessive detail? Were appropriate statistical methods used? Does the discussion actually address the research questions or the hypotheses or the objectives posed in the introduction. I find as a peer reviewer or editor, sometimes I find there's a mismatch, and the introduction will ask one thing, but the discussion will answer something else. So making sure there's a good match. Does the discussion put the results in enough context? And I think, to me, that often is really one of the differences between a paper drafted by a postdoc and a paper drafted by a graduate student. I think often a graduate student will be far enough advanced to be able to do well with the methods and results and a little of the discussion, but there won't be, true insight into how all the results fit in and not enough context. Whereas at the postdoc stage, I think a postdoc can often put things in much, much better and more meaningful context, more thorough context. If appropriate, does the discussion address strengths and limitations of the research? Are the appropriate parties acknowledged in the acknowledgements? And then, does the abstract accurately reflect the content of the paper? And you've noticed I put this last, even though the abstract is near the beginning, because that, I think, should be the thing that is edited or re-edited last, because it has to be consistent with the rest. So that was a brief checklist on scientific papers. I will now present a brief checklist on grant proposals. I realize this is a lot of checklists, so this might be another time to pause in between checklists and see if there are questions or things to add.
Yes, so we have a question from Candice. She said, she asked, how do you feel about the readability testing function in Word? Do you ever consider it as a factor in editing?
Yes, oh, that's great. Yeah, because you can have Word compute a readability, and I think it's a useful tool. I don't think it's a perfect tool. I wouldn't use only it, but I find it's helpful to me in flagging things. Basically, the readability tool in Word takes into account how long the sentences are and how long the words are, and then computes basically grade level. And so I will run that on a lot of things I do. I mean, it's not a perfect tool because one could be writing nonsense and it might still give a reasonable number. So you still have to look if it makes sense. But I find it flags me. Actually, it was just a couple of weeks ago, I was drafting a proposal, and somehow, and my sense was that the abstract was really hard to read. And I thought, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So I actually ran the readability score, and it was horrible. It was like sixth year postdoc something. And I thought, nobody's going to want to read something like that. So I actually went back, simplified the language, cut some of the really long sentences into 2 or 3 sentences. And to me, it read a whole lot better. And then when I recomputed it, it was like college sophomore level. And I thought, yeah, that's a lot more readable. So, yeah, so I will use it. And again, I don't think it takes care of everything, but I find it's a good reminder to myself for when I'm particularly using too many long sentences. Any other questions now, or should we?
I'd like to add something in that happened to me over this past week about checking your sources as you add them in. There was a failure of EndNote as I was writing and entering in sources. It was doing 2 things. At first, it was adding sources that I had already used as new sources. And it was also adding in sources that I was clicking on and trying to add. It was attaching another source. So it was the wrong source that it was adding in. So definitely as you're going through and writing and adding it in, check as you're writing, not at the end of the, not after you're done writing.
Very wise. Could have been a shame if you had thought you had added like 20 sources or something. Yeah, so check as you go. Very wise.
Yes, okay. Heather said, do you have an opinion about Grammarly? I've never used it, but I have colleagues who speak kindly about it.
Right, I have not used it either. I know some people who speak kindly of it. And again, my feeling from what I've seen and heard of it is that it can be a good tool, but it's just a tool. That it can, flag things to pay attention to, but then as a human being need to say, is this appropriate in this instance? Or for example, I think it may, let's say, flag passive voice. And often active voice is better, but sometimes passive voice really communicates better what's meant. So again, I think from what I've seen with Grammarly or similar tools, that it's a great tool, but the human being needs to make the final decision.
Thank you. And Rebecca asked, at what point do you suggest editing the title?
I guess my feeling is almost all along, but I find my titles often keep evolving. If I can get a good working title at the beginning, that's helpful because it helps me get my focus. But I find that often, it keeps evolving, and then it and the abstract are the things that I'll look at last, because sometimes I'll have a new idea, and then sometimes something will go into the journal, and then a peer reviewer and editor will come up with a better title. There was a short essay I had written that was really pleased that it appeared in the working life section of Science a few months ago. And I struggled and struggled and struggled with the title and kept revising, couldn't get it quite the way I liked it. And then the main editor working with it played with it, and it got worse. And then there was, a final editor who was taking final view, and he said, why don't you just say this? And it was really better than any of our titles, and we went with his title. So I think that's often really an iterative process.
Okay, that's all the questions that we have at the moment.
Okay,
at
good.
This point.
So
thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And so now we've caught our breath and are ready for another checklist. And this is one for grant proposals. I think one is, are the goals, research questions, or hypotheses clear? Is the originality of the work apparent? Is the work clearly relevant to the funding source's mission? Because I think some research, it's obvious where the link is. Other times need to make explicit how it's relevant. Is the importance of the proposed work explained? Is sufficient context provided? Is the amount of proposed work realistic? Are the people clearly capable of doing the proposed work? So, for example, if there are biosketches or CVs, do they make it clear that people have the needed abilities? Are sufficient justifications provided for choices? Let's say if there's an option of a couple techniques, let's say why you were using that technique. Is sufficient supporting evidence included? And is sufficient justification provided for budgetary items? If there's going to be cost sharing, is there enough information about it? If preliminary studies are required, or if they're advisable, is there enough information on them? If a timeline would be advisable, is one included? Tables and figures, should any of them be added or deleted? If evaluation plans are needed, are they sufficient? If dissemination plans should be included, are they sufficient? And again, getting back to the title, does the title clearly and accurately reflect the content? Because a proposal has to be persuasive, and one of the places it starts being persuasive is even just with the title. Again, near the end is the abstract, informative, and clear. Or let's say it's an NIH proposal, there would be a specific aim section, which is really crucial. Is that really informative and clear? And then just, is the proposal persuasive in all regards? Because so often funding agencies get so many good proposals that they're needing to really narrow them down and see if there's anything that makes it less than persuasive. So trying to be, is sort of the strictest reviewer. Is there anything about it that you think wouldn't be persuasive, that you think could be bolstered? A suggestion is to take these checklists, or the one in the source I'll mention later, is take them and customize them for your own use. Because given whatever, let's say, funding agencies you apply to, or the journals you use, you can adapt these checklists for your own use, and might want to even right now reflect on, if you were to adapt them, what's something that you'd like to add or delete? Let me mention some common problems to remedy. One of the common ones is simply a disregard of instructions. It's so common. I know journal editors are always complaining that people aren't following the instructions. I think another common problem is inattention to good models, that very often one can, for example, look at papers of the same type in the same journal, or look at someone's successful grant proposal and get some good ideas. Another common problem, I think, is lack of focus, for example, in a discussion section. Another is excessive redundancies. I find I'll often be too repetitive in writing a draft, particularly if I'm writing it at several different times. I may not quite remember what I said. And then when I read it over all at once, I realize I said the same thing 2 or 3 times and need to edit it. I think sometimes another problem is failure to make the reasoning explicit, that you may know the reasoning or the logic, but needs to be spelled out for the reader. Another problem is sometimes poor parallelism. Let's say there's a list, let's say a bulleted list, but things are in different formats. And so making it a consistent format or consistent grammatically. Another problem is excessive jargon. Obviously, if it's, let's say, a grant proposal or scientific paper, you need to use the proper technical terms. But sometimes I will, for example, see papers that have a bunch of lab slang, and that shouldn't be there. Another problem is pompous wording, just saying things in, really sort of puffed up way rather than saying things directly. Wordiness, again, I find my drafts often, I say things in ways that are much too long and I can really condense them, which adds to readability. And also a lot of things have a word count or a character count. And I find it's almost a game to get it under. For example, I'm working with a colleague on a proposal, and one part could only be 1,500 characters, and I think it was about 1,800, and found a way to get it down to the 1,500 without taking out any major content. Another problem sometimes is excessive use of acronyms or abbreviations, especially ones that the authors make up themselves, and it just confuses people if there are too many. People forget to define acronyms, and again, we mentioned overly long or overly convoluted sentences. So those are, I think, problems a lot of us have at least one of those that we can look for and remedy. In terms of condensing wording, maybe a little practice, you may be able to think, instead of saying absolutely essential, probably say essential, an adequate amount of, enough, are of the same opinion, agree, at the present time, now, consensus of opinion, consensus, despite the fact that, although, fellow colleague, colleague, has the potential to, can, in an efficient manner, efficiently. And I find sometimes just by going through and doing these kinds of things, I can reduce the length of a manuscript, maybe 5% or even 10%, without taking out any content. Some other examples, in most instances, usually, in the event that, if, is similar to, resembles, the majority of, most, on a daily basis, daily, take into consideration, consider, whether or not to, whether to, was of the opinion that, believed, needless to say, well, then don't say it. So I think those kinds of things, and I find when I'm drafting, it's not worth it to pay attention to these things. The important things, get the ideas down, but then going back and editing it can tighten it up. I think we have a few non-native English users here, and I think almost all of us, even if we're native English users, are working with some non-native English users. So a few tips here. I think one thing is, I think sometimes if one's writing in a language that isn't one's known, it's really common to worry a lot about grammar. But I think just remember, set your mind at ease that the content and clarity and organization are key. And so if a paper has good content and it's clear and it's well organized, even if there are a few grammatical errors, it's really easy for, let's say, an editor or a journal to polish it up. But if there are problems with the content, clarity, or organization, then, then it's more serious. One thing that can be helpful is to make your own little glossary or dictionary of common terms and phrases in your own specific research field. Some of you know I taught for 2 years in China at what's now Peking University Health Science Center, and I was teaching mainly scientific writing to faculty members there. And there was one person, remember, a neuroscientist there, and his spoken English was just so-so, but in his draft of his paper was really good, and particularly his word choice was so good. And I commented on, that I thought he had such great word choice. And he told me how he did it. He said he identified what he thought were the top 10 papers in his field from, first rank English language journals. And he went through and just found, words and phrases that he knew he would need for describing his own research. And then when he was writing, he would just refer to that. And since it was only words and phrases, it wasn't plagiarism at all. But that way, instead of his trying to come up with things, he had the vocabulary right there. I think another thing is to be alert for some of the aspects of English that tend to pose problems and maybe go through just checking for them. And this may differ from language to language, but for example, some languages don't have articles like the or and so need to check for them. Or the prepositions used in certain phrases will differ a lot from language to language, or use of verb tenses, or even whether there are verb tenses. So you may know, which of things really tend to cause problems for you, and then check specifically for them. Also, I think to be aware of the English language norms for sentence structure and sentence length. In English, it's usually subject, verb, object, whereas let's say in German or Portuguese, they can be different. And also sentence length. In English, it's usually sort of shortish or medium sentences, whereas often in Romance languages like Spanish or Portuguese, there are much, much longer sentences, and they work in those languages, but they don't work for English language scientific papers. So sometimes when I'm working with Spanish-speaking authors, we end up dividing some of the sentences. Another thing sometimes too that can be helpful is to realize that writing in English is more direct than that in some other languages. That in English language scientific papers, the expectation is to get right to the point and, for example, have a topic sentence that states the main point and then give the supporting information. Whereas in some other languages and cultures, the typical way of writing would be more to just sort of write around the point, but not directly address it. And then perhaps taking special care to avoid plagiarism. I think sometimes when one's not comfortable in the language, it's tempting to just borrow whole sentences or paragraphs, which obviously isn't appropriate. And also even different cultures have different views. I mean, in some cultures, it's considered okay or even a compliment to maybe take someone's paragraph. Whereas if you send something into a journal that has someone else's paragraph, it will not have good results. And one other thing sometimes is to check the spacing. For example, spacing between words or before or after punctuation when proofreading your work, because again, in different languages, the spacing will be different. And actually, this may be another good place to stop to see if people have anything to add here or to ask about here.
Yes, so Floris asked, what difference do you see in scientific writing between US English and UK English? Is there any preference?
Right, I know some journals have a preference for one or the other. And so I always like to look carefully at the instructions to authors to see if they have, state a preference. I find they're often in the sciences, there's not as much difference as in sort of popular writing, which would have more local slang and things. But two things that I sometimes see a little bit of difference in is there are some words that are spelled differently. And then sometimes there are slight differences in punctuation, for example, placement of quotation marks and things. What I will sometimes do if I actually had a paper a couple of years ago that was for an Australian journal that used British English. So what I did is, usually I have the spell checker in Word set to US English, but I had it set to British English. They may have even had a setting for Australian variant, I don't remember, or it may have been I just set it to UK. And that way it flagged, several of my spellings, and I was able to change them. I think in that regard, if one's a little bit off, one isn't, a journal's not going to say, she spelled color the American way, we can't publish her paper. But I try to make it as close as possible, and then usually, if there are a few things I miss, a journal could correct that. And if anybody has anything to add in that regard, I'd welcome it.
Okay, so Heather said, I recently used the UK English spell check in Microsoft and it was very useful.
Okay, good to hear. Great, yeah, because that's what I thought too.
And I think that if you read the instructions to the authors, they will actually say, to write in American or UK English.
Right, I find a lot of journals will. A few won't, but a lot of them will. Some will say they'll accept both, but often they will. Some of them I have even found they'll even have a list of specific terms and how they want them spelled. And sometimes if I'm, being really careful, if there's a word I'm not sure, which of the spellings to use, I'll just look at some other papers in the same journal and see how they're done.
And we have another question from Ashley. She said, how do you like to set apart time for writing or editing? I find that my to-do list is so long that writing takes lowest priority.
Right. And in fact, sometimes we could even have a whole other session on that. I find the same thing because I find often things get swamped by the things that people need right away, or, I've got to teach the class, there's email. And so I find something that I often need to do is really set aside blocks of time, that there are certain, let's say, times of the week that will be just writing times, and I will count them. They're just like, classes or appointments that, I have an obligation then and need to focus. I find different people have different approaches. I find some people find it's really helpful to write a little bit each day, for example, to write, a little bit each morning and things like that. I know many people swear by that. I find that doesn't work for me. I'm better off with bigger blocks, like saying Saturday morning I'm going to write, anyway, Saturday morning, Wednesday afternoon, things like that. So, and there have been studies showing that there's no one way, but that people who tend to be successful and productive have found a way that works for them and made it, sort of a part of their schedule. I mean, I tend to be really deadline driven, so I try to have a bunch of deadlines, but I think having some kind of a system, because otherwise I think it's really easy for things to go work week after week. I think also finding what time of day works for you. I have a colleague who is a real morning person, loves to get up 5 in the morning and work. I'm much better late at night. I'm much better when, everything quiets down in the house. If I can have a block of time from 10 at night until 2 in the morning, that's my favorite. But I think knowing how you work and actually making it part of your schedule, which is something I need to do now that particularly I have a new edition of the book that I have to finish the manuscript for. Let me move on and talk a little bit about proofreading. That is, once you're done with the editing, let's say your paper is accepted and you get the proofs back from, let's say, a journal, when you think you're totally done with your grant proposal and you want to look it over one more time, make sure there aren't typographical errors. So proofreading is checking for typographical errors and things. And a few things to look for. One is typographical errors. I find even a manuscript will go in electronically, I've checked it, and a misspelling will mysteriously appear. Or sometimes, let's say there's a Greek letter and somehow the program turns it into a swiggle. Sometimes we read the proof, somehow there's, part of the manuscript is the wrong typeface or the type size. So looking for that, spacing errors, and also incorrect placement of graphics. I remember one book proof I was looking at, and even though we had very clearly marked the orientation for a radiograph, they had printed it upside down, so it looked like there was someone standing on his head. So I think all of those are important to look for in the final proofreading. Another thing that I think is worth paying attention to is revising paper in response to reviewer feedback. So that's another kind of editing one's own work, and maybe sometimes a more stressful one, although if a paper has been provisionally accepted, I think there's particular motivation to do that. One suggestion is just to consider taking a little time to cool down. If you're like me, I'll get the reviewers' comments back, and even if they're basically favorable, when they're asking me things to do, my first reaction is, no, that's really not needed, it's too much work. And then if I come back maybe the next day or the day after, I think, yeah, they've got a point there. That probably would be an improvement, or doesn't make it any worse, and I should do it or do most of it. I think if there's a list of several things to do, it can be helpful to sort of triage things, figure out priorities, maybe start out, identify the things that are really easy to address, and just take care of those right away. So it reduces the list. But then also early on, identify anything that might take substantial time to address. For example, if you need to run another experiment or track some things down at the library or do some more analysis. And so identify them so you can start on them early enough so that the manuscript gets back in time. I mean, sometimes some of the things that are requested don't seem suitable and don't seem reasonable. And I think in that case, it's a matter of considering alternatives. I think then it's often trying to figure out what the underlying problem was and finding another way to address it. Because I think sometimes reviewers or editors will just say, you need to make this change. And you think, no, that's going to distort things, so that's not going to work. But then reflecting on it, you think, well, they wanted this change because of this problem, and their solution's not the best solution. I have another solution. And so I think very often, if you can find another solution for the problem, or if you realize, well, maybe something just wasn't said clearly, so they misinterpreted it. I've found editors are open to alternatives. I think particularly if they're tactfully presented. So I've heard of cases where people withdrew papers because they disagreed with a certain change, but usually you can negotiate something that will work for everybody. And then when you're returning the paper, clearly identify the revisions made. Often a journal will tell you how they want it done. For example, they'll say to use track changes or highlight things, but if they don't say how, list them or use track changes or highlight or something. So, because I know, having been the editor of a small journal, it's really frustrating to get something back that's been changed, but they don't really spell out the changes, and then I have to compare the two and see if everything was done. So make it easier for your editor to give you that final acceptance. And this may be also a good place to stop for a moment to see if people have things to add in this regard.
I don't see any questions at the moment.
If not, let me mention some resources for people who'd like more, or like some things that can be aids for editing one's work. Some of you may be used to using the one-look dictionary search. I have this bookmark and I use it all the time. I used it several times yesterday evening, in fact. And this is really nice because you can look up a word and access several dictionaries, sometimes many dictionaries, and see different definitions. Some of the dictionaries, you can listen to pronunciations. Some of them have examples of use in sentences. So I really like to use that to check, because sometimes I am not sure whether, let's say, a word I've used is being used appropriately, and that is helpful. There are lots of good resources on punctuation, but if people want a quick a good rundown, I have a link to a good handout from a writing center at another university. If you something more, if you're in any medically related field, I really like the American Medical Association Manual of Style. They have a really, really good section on punctuation and lots of good examples. I think those of you who've taken my course have been exposed to academic phrase bank, and this is really neat. This is from British University, and basically it's like a bank of examples of phrases that have been used in journal articles, and you can and they are broken down by like section or function, like introducing work or reporting results or writing conclusion, and within that by category. So let's say you had a surprising result. You know, in discussing findings, you can go down to the part that talks about different kinds of phrasing you can use to indicate that a result was surprising. So this, I think, can be really handy when you sort of know what you want to say but can't come up with quite the right wording for it. With regard to conciseness, I have a link to an article on some ways to make your writing more concise. Also, a project that I used to work with for quite a few years is called Author Aid, and this is a project mainly to help researchers in developing countries to write about and publish their work, but most of the resources apply to authors anywhere, and so there is a resource section, and some of the things in there can be helpful in editing one's own work. If any of you are editors or are thinking of becoming editors or interested in the fine points, I really like the book, the Copy Editor's Handbook, and then there's the Copy Editor's Workbook. New editions just came out about a year ago, and I used them in my editing class. And they're, again, available online through our library and are just great resources. If you'd like some reading that's similar to this talk, there's an article I wrote on editing and proofreading your own work, and that's you can access it through the link. It's available in Oak Trust here at A&M, and then the most recent edition of the book How to Write and Publish a Scientific Paper has a chapter on editing your own work, and this book also can be accessed online through the Texas A&M library. I'm really thankful to the library for making that available online. If you want more on these kinds of things, also some courses available this summer. If any of you particularly are maybe interested in exploring a possibility of an editing career, I'm giving a course on science editing. I'm giving it this semester and then also over the summer. And also before the session began, we were talking about my intensive course in research writing, which graduate students can take as VIB 655 and other people can take as sort of professional development courses. And if anybody wants more information about either of these courses, contact me. You have my email address on the front of these slides, and I'd be glad to share syllabi and details. And so now I think we're ready for open questions and answers. And sort of as we began, we had baked goods before, and now we have a plate of Texas pecans. This past year, you may recall, was an extra good year with extra big ones. So I didn't use a scale bar. This is a quarter to show how large these were. And so glad to open it up for any questions or things that you have to share based on your experience and knowledge.
Thank you, Dr. Gastel. We will welcome any questions. You can put them in the chat or you could ask her directly. So I found that the tip that you shared with us about, giving it a rest after receiving back feedback from reviewers to be very useful. I think I was having palpitations when I received, the reviews back. I was like, okay, I'm not going to look at it. And then the next day when I looked at it, I was like, it was actually really fair. The questions and the concerns that they had were very fair. And I felt like, okay, I could do this. I could answer them.
Yeah, great. No, that is a great experience to share. And I'm glad because I know, same thing, when I get them back, I'm almost afraid to look. And my first, impression is just to recoil. But then when I set it aside, they're often very reasonable.
So while we wait for people to ask any other questions, we will be sending out a PDF of this slide to the email that you've used to register for this session. And in May, we will be doing a wellness session in the midst of COVID-19. And hopefully in June, we will be doing one that's on data management, so you know how to better manage, the huge bank of data that you have. Yeah. So Dr. Gastel, I don't see any questions. A lot of people saying thank you for the session. They said that it was really helpful, especially the checklist. Yeah.
So, yes, well, this was my pleasure, and so glad you could join us, and wish you all the best, and feel free to be in touch.
Yes, thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone.
Have a good day, and thank you, Sue, for inviting me. Bye-bye, everybody.
Absolutely.